I'd like to start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the unceded land on which my institution lies, to acknowledge their elders, past, present and future, and their continuing connection to the land. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the custodial and cleaning staff who've prepared this facility for us today, and to acknowledge that the people who are involved in that kind of work often are part of demographic or other groups that are not particularly well represented amongst the conversations and the institutions that we have. And I say those things for two reasons. One is that I'll come back to at the end, is the question of how do we engage with those communities which we have traditionally excluded from our conversations and our institutions. And the second is because this is part of a way of talking about the challenges and issues that we've created for ourselves over the history of Western scholarship. So I want to talk about trust. This is billed as a session about accountability, responsible research and innovation, but I wanted to try and keep it really simple. So what I say may be blindingly obvious, but what I hope to do is maybe just slightly shift your perspective, give you a slightly different framework in which to think about it, and then Carol and the other talk will get down into the nitty-gritty of how you make this work in practice in the kind of context where you're working today. But I wanted to get up to a big picture view. So I wanted to start with two short stories. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I was at a meeting, and it was a meeting about open science in the context of disease research. And we were talking about cancer therapies and data sharing and all of those kind of great things. And then someone had got up and talked about the progress they'd made in improving survival prospects for a particular kind of cancer. And they showed one of those graphs that you're probably familiar with, percentage survival over the course of treatment. And you've got a curve which looks pretty terrible and a curve that looks better. And that's progress, right? That's what we consider as progress in medicine. And the talk was followed by a person who was a cancer patient advocate, who was, in fact, a cancer survivor. And they stood up, and the first thing they said was, "I wish you wouldn't put those graphs up. I have no interest in the percentage of people who survive to 6 months. I want to know whether I'm going to be able to take my kid to school next year. The question you're asking is the wrong question. The answer you're giving me is not helpful to me as a patient." Second story, slightly anonymised to protect the innocent. The disease outbreak in Colombia, actually a neglected tropical disease up in the highlands of Colombia. And this was an area that was of interest to the big charities that are concerned about neglected tropical diseases and working with them. And so the whole apparatus of Western medicine rolls in. They come in, they take the samples, they isolate the organism, they take that organism off to a lab in North America where they sequence it. Having sequenced it and understanding the species, the metabolism, the kind of things that you've been talking about, we'll be talking about in this project, they actually identified some new chemical entities, and they had some prospects of actually developing a drug against this new disease. The problem was that the root cause of the problem was an introduced fungal species that was damaging the bark that was used as the filtration system for the water facilities these people built for themselves. The problem had been purified away from its context so that the answer was no longer relevant to the people in situ. And I tell those two stories. I could tell stories, you've already heard some of these issues around the introduction of GMOs into food production. We could talk about the kind of craziness happening in US politics with relation to climate change or all of those kinds of things. But most of those stories, most of the stories we tell relate to a deficit in understanding. And that leads us into a trap of assuming that if we could just explain, if we could just provide the knowledge, then we would solve the problem. And without boring you with large quantities of research, we know that that's not the problem. Knowledge can be an issue for other groups, for broader publics, but the problem is not a deficit of understanding, and the problem is not solved by addressing any deficit of understanding that does exist. The problem is generally one of trust and context and listening to the question that the people involved actually have. So I want to focus really on trust and adopting the framework of Peterson from 2015 and talk about trust in these 5 particular characteristics that create trustworthiness. Now, one of the important things about trust is you can't just build trust, you can't make trust, you can't invest in trust. You can invest and build trustworthiness, and if you are lucky, by this process of interacting with integrity, being honest, being consistent, having good intent, and being transparent in the way you're operating with people, you will earn that trust over time. Now, you might think that I'm getting engaged here with a bunch of social theory. Actually, Peterson is Michelle Peterson, who runs this relationship advice blog. Now, I want you to think a little bit about the reaction you just had. Now, okay, it was a joke, right? Do you now trust this information less because it came from a public space? I will admit, in looking for these things, I got really irritated. These people are not terribly good at citing their sources. But these people have much bigger communities. This is a person who makes a living out of running this web property. They are delivering a lot of value to the people who consume and use the kind of knowledge they're producing. And yet this is kind of totally alien to us. I mean, how would we know that it's been done properly? Where's the provenance? Where's the information? Where's the referencing? This is not something that we would trust, but it is something that other people do trust and use. And it actually turns out this stuff's a lot clearer. If you actually get into the social theory on trust, it's almost totally incomprehensible to work through. It's very difficult stuff. Okay, so I'm actually going to give you some social theory. I'm going to give you some social theory of knowledge because it's an important part of the story I want to tell. And what I want to talk about when we talk about knowledge creation, the stuff that we do, the stuff that's the raison d'etre of the funding, that delivers capacity and understanding to do good in the world. So what we're doing, what we tend to be doing, starts off as circulation within a small community. It can be a single person doing research in the lab before they talk to someone else. It might be a research group. It might be a discipline. And we circulate these ideas and claims within the group. But the important thing happens, the point at which we actually create knowledge that can be used, is when we transfer that across the boundaries of the group where it's created to a new group. And we do that by transferring some kind of object. Now, in our formal scientific communication space, we do that through publication. The group circulates a set of claims, comes to a set of ideas, transfers an object out into a shared space, and through a process of peer review, which is a process of, if you like, stylized conflict in a sense, but criticism in a situation, and everyone knows referee 2 didn't understand what it was you were actually trying to say, right? There is miscomprehension, lack of understanding. There's a deliberate lack of trust, deliberately set up, that the referee is to not take what you're saying on faith. The editor is not going to assume you've done all the right things. That is going to be tested. But what happens through that process, whether it's through formal publication, but it might also be through interdisciplinary work, through the process of having to work out how to talk to each other, that when that knowledge and understanding, when that claim is transferred into a new group, where it is different, and that's really important, when it arrives at its place, the work that some of you do in the lab to generate numbers that can get used in computational models, the numbers you generated in the lab are not the same thing as get used in the computational models. The knowledge is different, and neither of those two sides actually fully understand the process that's going on. But you build up trust and a common language. And what's important about this process is that not only do you transfer it one way, but actually it gets transferred back. And again, I could talk a lot about the history of science communication here, but one of the things that's really interesting is the history we tell when we teach science is always false. Because in almost every case, the story we tell about the person who discovered something, almost always a white European male, of course, but that's another again, almost in every case would not be able to understand the version of that story we tell in our classrooms today. Robert Boyle would not have understood Boyle's law. It would have made no sense to him whatsoever. And so knowledge is a product of translation. And that's, you've heard about the importance of interdisciplinary work. You've heard about the importance of working with industry. That you're translating this work across boundaries into spaces where it can be used. So it's translation across group boundaries. And what that means is that in the testing and production of knowledge that can be used across groups and perhaps beyond our communities and into broader society, is that diversity is a first order concept. So communicating across a broader and more diverse set of groups makes better and more robust science. Again, go back to those things that Feynman and others always said. If you can't teach it, you don't understand it. If you can't explain it to a high school kid, then we don't understand it in a way that's meaningful. And also that this is happening at all the various different scales. Like I said, from the individual research group, to the department, to the discipline, to the broader domain of knowledge, and then beyond that, to broader communities. So I think I'm reasonably safe in saying that one of the shared frameworks we have in this room is the concept of evolution. It is a thing which we can use to communicate effectively with each other, despite the fact that, things I heard yesterday, I don't understand what those computational people do. I don't understand what that person's doing in the lab to generate the numbers we use. I don't trust, there's only 3 other labs in the world that I would trust with handling these particular cells. But we have these shared frameworks, and evolution is one of them, despite the fact that we actually mean quite different things by it. Genes are another aspect. If I start poking people, every single person in the room would have a different understanding of what a gene is and how they would define it. But we use it as a shared construct, which we kind of get away with because we kind of feel that we understand. One of the challenges we face is that we focus very much on the boundaries and on the differences. I've just talked about 2 things, evolution and genes, which actually in some ways define the difference between a scientific community and the broader community. If you find someone who doesn't take evolution seriously as a way of communicating about what is going on in the biological world, then you found someone who you probably think isn't a scientist. Someone who's didn't immediately after that NASA press release went live last week where they said one of these 2 astronauts had 7% of their genes changed and go, what? But that, for us, 7% genes changed? No, sorry, something's gone horribly wrong here. Obviously, not 7% of expression of genes. Expression of 7% of genes. And yet that story went across the world in 50 minutes, an hour and a half, described in just that way. We think about the differences that define us, and we think about those differences right down into our little disciplinary spaces. And we don't think so much about the commonalities. And so I want to make the point that these communities are fractal, and that the differences between our disciplinary and group communities are very similar to the differences between our broader community, the scientific community, the research community, and society at large. Those are differences of scale and differences of quality. They're not absolute differences in form. And so these processes are happening at the same scale. And that means that trust is the same problem at all scales, which means that building trust starts at home. We don't have trust often within our communities. We have crises of reproducibility, we have crises of, in some cases, fraud, certainly poor incentives that create incentives to do the wrong kind of things, to focus more on publishing than on actually understanding and doing good science. So if we go back to these 5 aspects and start thinking about how we tackle them internally in our community, then we can draw some fairly clear lines. You know, the integrity, we have strong sense of what makes research with integrity. We have mechanisms, and Merton referred to these as organised scepticism, that keep us honest, because we know that at scale, you can't always trust groups to behave well. So we need systems that are in place to keep us honest. When it comes to consistency, we need standards. We need standards of communication, technical standards, but also reporting and communication standards. And these are all things that Carol is going to go on and talk about in some detail about the mechanics of how we do this for our community, how we make this communication more transparent, more open, more standards driven, more testable, and ultimately to help drive greater integrity. Now, the challenge here, one of the part where it does get harder as we move to larger and more distant groups, like broader society, is this one at the bottom. If I ask you why we do science, I'll get a series of answers about understanding the world. I'll get a series of answers about being able to do things, be able to change things, be able to build things. And we kind of, as a community, again, we trust and assume that we have a common sense. Now, I started off in your space. It's kind of ironic, but my last major contribution was probably to describe why it was that short-read sequencing, this newfangled next-generation sequencing, wasn't actually going to be able to deliver genome sequences. And of course, then yesterday we hear about, 8,000 genomes out of an environmental sample. So, things have moved on a bit. But I've moved from the sciences, I've moved from being well and truly inside your community into the humanities. And this thing of intent, of assuming that you understand what it is you're doing, that's the gap between the sciences, some of the qualitative social sciences, and the humanities. I will pose the question that I don't think you always do know what you're doing. And that's because the humanities brings a particular kind of skill set, which is quite alien to the sciences, around really critically examining whether we are asking the right question, why we are asking the questions we ask. And it's a set of skills which I really recommend to you. It's the same set of skills that get you down that rabbit hole of there's no such thing as a fact and you can't trust anything. But actually as a set of tools and skills for saying, why is it we're asking this question and not that question? Why are we worried about this and not that? Why are we talking to this group but not that group? And that set of skills really helps you to hone better questions, and better questions give you better science. Now, obviously this is easier with nearby groups, and I want to come back to where I started, because the big questions we face as a species, as a global ecosystem, those are climate change, environmental collapse in some places, are serious ones, and ones that are actually really difficult for the sciences we have to tackle at a global level. And yet there is this pool of knowledge that we don't draw on, and we can't draw on. And that pool of knowledge is that's tied up in Indigenous knowledge. We are starting to understand, and I use the term we advisedly, that the native inhabitants of Australia weren't hunter-gatherers as much as they were actually farming and managing land on a vast scale that is unimaginable by Western standards. The same is true, or seems to be emerging as a story, for many of these Indigenous communities, that agriculture, what we would call agriculture, was a common thing. And I say we, because the Indigenous communities have always known that they had done this, had always known that they had the knowledge. But we told ourselves stories about the stories that they had. Their knowledge is inaccessible to ours. And more than that, as a result of doing that, we've created situations where those Indigenous communities are not particularly interested or motivated to share that knowledge about tracking the effects of climate change, about mitigation of those effects in agriculture, about understanding how to achieve sustainable agriculture in these systems. So the challenge we face is one of building up this trust. It's easier to start with the work we need to do anyway, with reproducibility, transparency within our community. To ask what questions are the important ones, to test each other and to build those frameworks. But ultimately, we need to build those out much larger. And for all of the complicated words around responsible research, innovation, collective impact, all of these things, fundamentally, that's really just about being worthy of the trust of the people we're trying to help. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Have some time for comments and questions and reflection. So
If I haven't scared everyone.
I think they're thinking. They look like that, at least. While you are thinking, I will ask one of my many questions. So if we return to your cancer patient saying, you know, I'm not really helped by your overall survival curve. I think then probably we could have two interpretations of trust in that setting. I would like you to comment on that. So I think one comment would be that you have this, again, white male doctor, perhaps in his 50s, like me, saying, trust me, I'm a doctor. You will understand at some point that, you know, the knowledge that I'm producing is very good for you. Or you could have an understanding of trust, which is more a kind of dialogical concept of having a conversation in good faith, where I don't trust you necessarily in the sense of giving you all the responsibility for taking the decisions for me, right?
Mm. And that process of building up a dialogue and building up understanding and knowledge is often a cyclical process. I'd go one deeper. The point that this particular person was making was that effectively the entire apparatus of randomised control trials, which are intended, which are a way we have built to keep ourselves honest, right? So the point of a randomised control trial, double-blind, whatever, what those kind of experimental apparatus, is to protect ourselves from fooling ourselves and getting the answer that we might want, right? That's the whole purpose of this apparatus. And it's very good. So we've built these really amazing systems that help us answer questions that are structured in a particular way. And the question that a randomised control trial answers is, at the level of a population, if we choose to make this intervention in this particular case, will this, on average, you know, make patients better, save money in some cases? That's what that entire apparatus is incapable of answering. Is the question that actually could build the trust between physician and patient, which is, given that I have this very specific person in front of me who presents with this history and this specific set of symptoms, what is the best course forward? And so there's some really interesting stuff being done on end of one clinical trials and stuff that kind of starts to address that. But we have some built up baggage where we talk about gold standards and assumptions about what the best way to do things is, where we may need to start questioning some of the assumptions we were making, or at least, and again this goes to what Carol will talk about in terms of interoperability of data and its ability to be reused and systems that would allow you to reinterpret the data collected in those trials so as to deliver detailed information with Bayesian inference or whatever, wave hands systems that would help that. And that process, the view that the patient has that that's being done is a powerful way, again, to build up that trust and think about those things.
Exactly. And I think some members of the audience would also argue that biomarkers is a bridge concept between the two ways of thinking. We have time for one more question, if you wish. Yes, please. Is there a microphone, or do we use mine? Yep. Yep. Please let us know your name and, yeah, please.
My name is Sheng from Sintef. I don't agree with you about the deficit of understanding is a problem, because I think people usually suffering from Dunning-Kruger effect when they don't have the knowledge that they have, but they're very confident on what they believe in. So I think still people need to have the good understanding of the field that they are arguing with, and we need to provide understanding, of course, but also I don't think, it's sometimes people believe in whatever they want to believe, so it's no matter what you want them to trust you or not.
That's true, and that's going to be more true for groups that are more different. But there's sort of two answers to that. Is one, we can stand in our ground and say, no, we know the truth. We're telling you the truth. We're right. You're wrong. And as someone said the other day, if we want to push it, then we'll dress up the broccoli of knowledge in the chocolate of understanding, chocolate of entertainment. But it's not very good politics, to be blunt. So even if we are right, it's not a good way of convincing people that they should take into account our point of view. I would also say there are very many very well-documented cases where it's turned out that the experts were in fact wrong in an important way. Not wrong about the statement within the frameworks in which we were operating, but wrong in an important way in misunderstanding what was actually happening in the context that was being talked about. So yes, Dunning-Kruger is a real thing. There are people who are driven by political and financial incentives to deny things that they know are true, that they believe are true, as well. So, but the caveat to that, I would say, is the politics of the situation is such that showing a bit of humility, listening, and seeking to understand the perspective of the people you're arguing with will create much more value than simply generating another infomercial or another infographic or explainer that gives them the same information that was already there anyway.
Thank you, and we should have paid you for asking that question, because I know half of the audience actually thinks that, so it's very good to bring it to the table. Thank you very much, Cameron, and then we have this wonderful present for you, which I don't know what it is, but it's surely wonderful. You have to trust me on that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.